Hello Year 5 and 6, we are reading a new book now for our Reading for Pleasure, and it is called The Trapdoor Mysteries, A Sticky Situation, and it's by Abby Longstaff, and I'm going to read chapter 1 to you today. Chapter 1. Tally lived in a beautiful old mansion called Mollet Manor. It had fairy tale turrets and splashing fountains. It had fancy ballrooms and four-poster beds. It had secret passages and hidden doors and an ancient stone circle in the garden. But if you wanted to find Tally, you would have to go down the tapestry corridor, past the ballroom, through the servants' hall, into the kitchen, to the scullery. For Tally was the servant girl. She slept in the largest of the 3 scullery sinks. She was the one who dusted the turrets and cleaned the fountain. She polished the ballroom floor and ironed the silk sheets. She was the smallest and lowliest member of the household. And she was also the most clever. Where this brilliance came from, nobody knew, but because nobody knew quite where Tally came from. Not even Tally herself. She knew her name was Tallulah. She knew she was 10 years old. She knew she had once lived with her mother. She even remembered bits of her past. The jangle of Ma's bracelets, the sound of her singing her favourite song, the feeling of being snuggled up listening to a bedtime story. But Tally didn't remember her mother's name. She didn't know where she had been born, and she didn't know where her mother was now. Dead, Mrs. Sneed would say whenever Tally asked. Then the housekeeper would give a cross sniff as if looking after Tally was a lot of trouble. Mrs. Sneed had found her 8 years ago, when Tally was only 2. She complained to Tally almost every day about what an inconvenience it had been. "Your wailing made me walk all the way down the garden," Mrs. Sneed grumbled each time she told the story. "All the way across the lawn, all the way through the forest, and all the way to the sea. And there you were, snivelling, right on the edge of the cliff, so selfish and thoughtless. You weren't even doing anything useful." Tally could recall the feel of the wind that day, whipping her pinafore against her legs. She could still picture the crumbling rocks. There was something else she saw in her memories. Her mother dancing with shining eyes. "Oh, it's so magical here. One day you'll get to see it, Tallulah. Thousands of books, just like I told you." Ma ruffled Tally's baby curls and sighed. "We can't stay much longer, sweetheart. We're not really supposed to be here. Come on. There's something I need to get from the cliff. Then we'll sneak back out through the hole I showed you in the wall." Tally remembered warm hands setting her down. She clutched her little teddy bear. "Just sit there," a soft voice said. "I'll be back in a moment, darling." The rest of the memory came in flashes. A stumble, a scatter of pebbles, a lace hem of Ma's skirt snapping in the breeze, then disappearing. Tally's fingers reached out. But all that was left of Ma was a scrap of lace in Tally's hand and a handmade teddy on her lap. "Ma!" Tally cried and cried. The sound of footsteps, then a woman with narrow eyes and pinched lips staring down at her. "Ma gone," little Tally sobbed. "So, what am I supposed to do with you?" The woman tipped her head to the side and cracked her long neck. Creak, crack. "Come with me," she sighed. "I may as well find a use for you." Tally held out her arms to be carried, but the woman jerked away. "You have feet, don't you?" she snapped. She picked up Tally's teddy and flung him over the cliff. Then she turned on her heel and marched back to the manor house, leaving Tally to toddle after her. That was Tally's first memory of her mother, and her first memory... That was Tally's last memory of her mother, and her first memory of Mrs. Sneed. Since then, she'd been living at Mollet Manor, home of Lord Edward Mollet and his sister, Beatrice. Mrs. Sneed had put Tally to work straight away. Dusters were tied to the bottom of her feet so that every step she took could be useful. As soon as she was old enough to reach the countertops, she was given a cloth to polish them. By the time she was 3 years old, Tally woke every day to a long list of duties. Nowadays, Tally did almost all the work around the manor, washing and cleaning and fetching and carrying. She'd never been to school and never played with other children. No one outside the manor knew she existed. Monday morning, Tally was busy as usual. Mrs. Sneed and Mr. Brood, the butler, were in particularly mean moods. They'd set Tally the task of cleaning the entire mansion. As Tally filled her bucket in the kitchen sink, they were competing to be the bossiest. Mrs. Sneed snapped in her spiky voice, and Mr. Brood boomed in his deep voice. Mr. Brood could never remember Tally's name. Even now he was struggling. Tilly, Tooly, he bossed, scrub the cloister. Tally, snapped Mrs. Sneed, polish the door hinges. Twally, Mr. Brood boomed, tidy the study. Tally, cried Mrs. Sneed, sweep the ballroom. Boss, boss, boom, snap, snap, yap, all morning long. Tally sighed as she carried her bucket through the kitchen. Nothing she did was good enough. No matter how hard she worked, Mrs. Sneed and Mr. Brood were still going to grumble. On days like this, Tally missed her mother so much. She missed well done, darling, and I'll kiss it better, and good night, sweetheart. Most of all, she missed, shall we have a story? Where was Ma? Deep in her heart, Tally knew Mrs. Sneed was wrong. Ma wasn't dead. She couldn't be. But what happened to her? Where was she now? Why hadn't she come to find Tally? Tally shook herself to clear the questions away. As she scrubbed the cobblestones in the cloister, Tally imagined Ma was sitting right beside her. Once upon a time, Ma said, inside Tally's head. Imagination was Tally's secret power. She could endure all her boring jobs because her thoughts were whirling and buzzing and bouncing and fizzing. Her mind put on shows, telling stories, singing secret songs, and playing with words and pictures. All this happened while Tally was sweeping the pond or dusting the trees. Ma had loved stories. She used to tell Tally about Peter Pan in Neverland and Mowgli in the jungle. Even though Tally had been really little, somehow the tales had stuck fast in her brain. She could picture the pirates as she polished, or hear Baloo's voice as she mopped. Sometimes Ma had even made up her own tales. They were funny ones about a bear who escaped from the zoo and got up to all kinds of fun. Ma used to draw pictures of the bear wearing different hats as he became a train driver or a fireman. She'd made Tally a little cloth teddy to be Mr. Bear, and he'd bounce up and down growling, "I'm off on an adventure." Well, he did, until Mrs. Sneed threw him over the cliff. "Tally," came a spiky voice from a window above her, "I told you to polish the door hinges." Tally gave the cobbles one last wipe and went back inside the manor house. She picked up her duster and rubbed at the dull brass hinges until they sparkled. She could see her face in the shiny metal now, a head of dark curls, a flash of green eyes. She carried her bucket along the hallway and up the stairs to Lord Mollet's study. Lord Mollet was a very important writer, his sister said over and over again. He had once written a book called The Hairstyles of Poisonous Spiders, a thorough analysis. Now he spent most of his time drinking coffee and staring out of the window. Tally dusted the glass cabinet outside his room. It held his favourite ornaments. There was a set of cufflinks and a tiny silver bear, an old pocket watch and a diamond ring. There was even a funny brooch made out of a bit of sea glass. It was in the shape of a spider's body, and it had spindly wire wound round it for legs. I wonder why he's kept it, Tally thought, peering through the cabinet. The spider didn't look smart and expensive like his other things. Tally quietly opened the study door. Phew, his lordship wasn't there. Tally wasn't supposed to talk to the lord and lady. She was supposed to stay in the background, unseen, to zip in and out of rooms, dusting and polishing. She gave the red wool rug a shake and plumped up the cushions on Lord Mollet's reading sofa. Then she cleared a large pile of half-drunk coffee cups from the windowsill and turned her attention to his desk. She sharpened all of Lord Mollet's pencils and tidied up the newspapers. She read the headlines as she went. Crime soars in village. Soap stolen from chemist. Thieves make a clean getaway. Tally lifted a heavy book to dust underneath. The cover had a picture of a spider with 8 hairy legs, and a scorpion, also with 8 legs, and a long pointy tail. Arachnids was the title on the front. Tally sounded the word out slowly. An arachnid must be a kind of animal, she reasoned, one with 8 legs. As she swept, the book fell open in her hand. She couldn't help glancing towards the page. Tally's eyes widened as she read that spiders don't smell with noses. Instead, they have scent-sensitive hairs on their legs. There was a little footnote explaining more about it. Tally's eyes darted to the doorway, her heart beating fast. The hallway beyond was empty. Tally breathed a sigh of relief. She wasn't supposed to know how to read. Mrs. Sneed regarded reading as dangerous. It would give Tally ideas. "I never learned to read, and it hasn't done me any harm," Mrs. Sneed would say. Tally knew this wasn't true. One time she had seen Mrs. Sneed put her head in the oven and nearly burn it by not being able to read the label on the oven that said, "Do not insert head." Secretly, over the years, Tally had taught herself to read. She'd practiced a letter here, a word there, starting with labels on bags of flour and instructions on cleaning bottles, and graduating to whole pages of Lord Mollet's books and newspapers. Tally had learned all kinds of fascinating things. From an envelope, she'd even discovered that Lady Mollet's full name was Beatrice Ursula Mollet, so her initials spelled B-U-M. Tally turned her attention back to the book in her hand and read about the different patterns in spiders' webs. The duster hung limply from her hand, forgotten. Then suddenly, "Where is that girl?" screeched a voice from downstairs. "Oh," Tally jumped and knocked a pile of magazines off the desk. I'm here. I'm just tidying." Tally put the book back and hastily began dusting again. Her duster paused over more books bound in leather, begging to be read. She stroked her fingertips over the embossed titles. Would she ever have books of her own? A thought tugged at the back of her mind. Books? Thousands of them. But where? No matter how much she concentrated, she couldn't call to mind a picture of them. "Hurry up," barked Mrs. Sneed. Tally could hear angry footsteps marching up the stone stairs. "Coming," Tally called back, giving the book one last sweep of the duster. By the end of the day, every bone in Tally's body ached. After she'd finished dusting, Mrs. Sneed had made her clean out all the fire grates, and Mr. Bude had ordered her to polish the marbled floor of the ballroom with a toothbrush. Now she was so tired, all she could do was chew a bit of stale bread and jam and climb into her sink to sleep. As she tried to get comfortable between the taps, she could hear Mrs. Sneed and Mr. Bude in the kitchen, finishing off the leftovers from the grand dinner. Tally had cooked for everyone else. She listened to them crunching on perfect crispy roast potatoes and gorging on creamy leeks, and clamped her hands over her belly as it let out a loud rumble. "Did you hear about those burglaries in the village?" Mrs. Sneed asked Mr. Bude, as she scraped a fork across her plate. There was a splash as Mr. Bude refilled his wine glass. "Farmer Miggins told me they crept in last night and poached some eggs." "Poached some eggs?" Mrs. Sneed echoed. "Now there's brazen for you. You wouldn't have thought they'd have the time." "What? Poached eggs take 6 minutes. I've seen Tally do it." "Don't be a nincompoop, Mrs. Sneed," Mr. Bude exclaimed. "I mean poached as in stole. They stole the eggs." "Oh, I'll thank you not to call me a nincompoop, you nincompoop," Mrs. Sneed replied. There was a scrape of a chair as she rose sharply. "Well, don't call me a nincompoop, you blockhead." Tally heard another scrape of a chair and the sound of their bickering voices as they left the kitchen, and all the dirty dishes for Tally to clear up in the morning. Their footsteps faded away as they walked to their rooms. She wriggled, drawing her feet up to find a better position against the cold enamel of the sink. Everything fell silent. The moon shone bright through the scullery window, sending long pale shadows across the stone floor. Tally clutched tight to the only bit of her mother she still had, the tiny scrap of lace from Ma's skirt. She closed her eyes and made a wish on the moon. "I wish," she whispered, "I wish someone would tuck me in and read to me." She waited a moment, just in case, just to see if her wish would come true. There was a scuttling sound of tiny claws on tiles. A mouse was running across the kitchen. Crash! Tally's eyes shot open. She waited a moment, but all was quiet again. The mouse must have knocked something off the table. Tally pulled her thin blanket over her shoulders. Maybe one day she'd see her mother again. Maybe.